Hello everyone and welcome to this chess openings video, and today we have an Italian game introduction. So we're going to go over the Italian game. This is probably a good opening for beginners especially to learn. Even if you don't decide to stay with this opening, it's good to learn it because it teaches you a lot of opening principles and things that you can use in no matter what openings you're playing. But let's get started here. I'll at least show you the opening moves. So for the Italian game, white will start with e4. E4 is a great move. It gives room for your bishop and your queen to develop. It gains space in the center and controls the d5 square. And then black would respond with e5, which was the second most played move in this database after c5. So black takes an equal share in the center and keeps the game even. And then after knight to f3, developing a piece. So in the opening, you definitely want to get your pieces off the back rank and into the action as fast as you can. Chess is kind of like a race to see who can get their pieces out the fastest. And you don't want to let your pieces sitting here at home on the back rank. Imagine if two street gangs were trying to fight each other, and one side just sent 2 or 3 members out to fight, and the other gang just sent everybody. Well, those 3 would have a tough time defending against everyone. Okay, maybe that's a bad example, but continuing on, knight to f3 is played, which develops a piece and attacks this, or excuse me, develops a piece and protects this pawn which is being attacked by white's knight. So next we have bishop to c4, which is the Italian game. The most common move in this database is bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez, which is also a great opening, but it can be pretty complicated. So that could be an opening you want to try later when you have more experience. But if you're starting out, bishop to c4 or d4 is a good move, or even knight to c3, just continuing to develop pieces and pushing pawns in the center. But today we'll just focus on bishop to c4, which starts the Italian game. So what does this move do? Well, multiple things, and that's usually an indication that a move is good when you can achieve more than one thing with that move. So here we're developing a piece off the back row, and so now the king is ready to castle kingside and get the king safe and develop the rook closer to the center. But this move also attacks a valuable central square here on d5 and aims at the king side, especially this weak f7 pawn, which can only be protected by the king at the moment. Is only protected by the king at the moment. If white piled up pieces on this pawn, it might be difficult to defend that. So now if we look at the most common responses, it looks like the top 2 are either bishop to c5 here. And what does that do? It kind of keeps the game even. Both bishops are developed, both knights are developed, both pawns. And it also eyes the center and this f2 square here. So this is the most common move played by black, and it also gets black closer to castling, after he just moves his knight up here to f6. So from here, what should white do? Well, the most common move is c3. which, although that does block the c3 square from the knight, it does set up the possibility of pushing this pawn forward where it would be protected by a pawn. So I'll go over that move quickly. So c3, this move basically covers this b4 square, but more importantly the d4 square, getting ready to push this d pawn up to d4 where it gains space, attacks the bishop, and so if the e pawn were to capture this d pawn after it moves forward, the c pawn could recapture and drive the bishop away, forcing black to take time out to retreat. All right, so now it looks like the most common move is knight to f6. So a good developing move. It also attacks this unprotected pawn here, and it controls central squares, and it gets ready for the black king to castle kingside here. And something to watch out for is if black doesn't hurry and castle, this knight could potentially jump up here with the bishop and try and put pressure on this f7 square here. Okay, so now the most common move is to just play d3, a safe move here to bolster this e pawn, and basically, also let room for this bishop to be developed. So I'll go with the most commonly played moves, even though we move c3, to be able to push to d4. At least here, we can still do that later, and we also keep the knight out of this square. And anyway, this d3 pawn is just bolstering and defending this very important e4 pawn. Okay, so continuing on, the most played move is d6 now. So both sides are following basic opening principles, developing pawns in the center, then developing pieces. Usually you want to get your knights out quicker because they're slower than the other pieces. And also, usually the knights are almost always placed the best by putting them here on c6 and f6 or c3 and f3. So most of the time you can't go wrong by putting your knights there, and that gives you time to wait and see where the best place to put your bishops will be. All right, so moving on. Now it looks like castling is the most common move here. So white gets the king safe. In the corner here, the king can only be attacked from two directions, head on or from this side. But he also has these pawns here and the knight, creating a wall around him to protect him. Okay, so continuing on, now it looks like a6 is the most commonly played move. So generally, you want to develop your pieces as fast as you can and not normally push the pawns on the side of the board because they don't really do too much to influence the center. But in this case, this was a defensive move that was played to keep this bishop from developing here and pinning the knight to the queen here. So if you're going to move your pawns on the side, it's usually okay to move them up here, one square to h6. Also, if black castles, that would leave a little escape square for the king in case there are any future attacks on the back rank here. Okay, now, the most commonly played move next here by white is rook to e1. So developing the rook behind a pawn that you've pushed forward. So it helps protect that pawn, and you can maybe use the pawn as a battering ram if it is able to move forward and attack things. And here it looks like castling is most commonly played by black. So he gets his king safe, develops the rook closer towards the center. And now white most commonly plays h3 to prevent the bishop from pinning the knight, or knight at b to d2, just developing another piece. So I won't go too much deeper into this variation. Otherwise the video would be quite long, and this is just an introduction. So maybe I'll go deeper into Italian game variations in another video. But basically, white is going to decide how to develop the other knight, which will probably have to go here to d2, and maybe he wants to develop his bishop to this square e3 to challenge black's bishop. But that is your goal in the opening, is to push some central pawns, control space in the center, develop your pieces as fast as you can, and you usually don't want to move pieces more than once in the opening unless you're forced to, unless you have to capture something. And then you just want to develop your pieces off the back rank as quickly as possible. Move the queen usually to the second or third ranks where it's safer. If you push the queen out too far, too fast, it could become a target and be chased around the board by other of your opponent's pieces. And then once your rooks are connected, it's good to place them in behind pawns that have been pushed forward, or on half open or completely open files. All right, so let's go back. We'll reset this and start again. So the opening moves, e4, e5, knight to f3 attacking the pawn, knight to c6 defending, and then bishop to c4, the Italian game. Now, we looked at this bishop to c5 move, which is called the Giuoco, if I pronounce that correctly, Giuoco piano game, which I believe means something like the quiet game in Italian, maybe. I'm not an Italian speaker or expert, so here both sides have their pieces developed to good squares, and the game continued as we showed. So if your opponent does not play this move, the bishop to c5 move, and instead plays the second most commonly played move, knight to f6, well, then we have the two knights defense variation in the Italian game. This is also a good move as it develops both your knights quickly and before the bishops, giving you more time to decide where you want to place your bishops. And this knight attacks this unprotected pawn. It develops a kingside piece to get this king closer to castling. And so now the most commonly played move here is d3. So we'll just take a look at that. d3 takes care of this problem here of the unprotected pawn and allows room for this other bishop to develop. So then the game might continue with the most commonly played move in this position looks to be e7 instead of moving to bishop to c5. So then white usually castles, the most played move by quite a bit. Black castles. So both sides get their kings safe, get their rooks closer towards the center. And then the game would continue with rook to e1 usually being played next by white to help defend the central pawn in case the d pawn wants to be pushed forward later in the game. And also, maybe to just put pressure up this e file and attack later. So next, it looks like d6 is the most common move played. And then now white has multiple moves here. Looks like a4 is played the most, just gaining space on the queen side. And also that c3 move can be played to help fortify the d4 pawn push here in the center. So now if we look at this a4 move, once again, this is not influencing the center much. It's not developing a piece, but this is the most commonly played move. And, maybe this is played at a higher chess master level, and, experience has shown that this is a good move here. And it looks like now the most commonly played move is to move a piece again in the opening with knight to a5 here. So now the game is getting a little bit tricky because pieces are being moved more than once in the opening, and usually you don't want to do that. But here he is attacking the bishop, trying to get rid of the bishop pair, which would be an advantage. If one side has a bishop pair and the other does not, that can give you an advantage because you'll have a bishop that covers squares that your opponent cannot cover anymore after they lose their bishop. All right, so here it looks like the most common move is, of course, to retreat the bishop to a2 here and avoid losing that bishop pair. So now c5, it looks like, is the most commonly played move. And what does this do? It pushes a pawn, one of the central pawn, not the very center, but right next to the center. And this is a good move because it influences this d4 square, which white usually likes to attack by pushing the c pawn and then pushing the d pawn. So now I'll play a couple more moves. So white usually goes ahead with his plan with c3 to help fight for this d4 square. And then now that the knight is not doing much over here, it can retreat back behind the pawn. So black does lose a little bit of time having to move this knight again. But now we see that a3 is one of the the most commonly played move. And so from here, maybe the knight will have to reposition to c2 and then fight for the center. So the game's getting a little more complicated here. But in general, in the opening, you want to just push your central pawns, try and control the center, develop your knights before the bishops, which gives you time to see where would be best to place your bishops. Then move your queen up to the second or third rank so you can connect your rooks together, and then be able to move those rooks in to help push your pawns forward. You can put them behind those pawns, and eventually you want to get your rooks on half open or completely open files and try and control those. And of course you want to castle your king to safety. You don't always have to castle, but especially beginners, it's generally a good idea to castle quickly. All right, so we'll go back again here to the beginning and just take another quick look at things after the opening moves: e4, e5, knight to f3, attacking the pawn, knight to c6 defending, and bishop to c4 developing the bishop, attacking the center and this f7 pawn, getting the king ready to castle. So this is the Italian game. And we took a quick look at c5 here, a knight to f6. Other options are a passive bishop move with bishop to e7, d6 protecting the central pawn, and getting ready to develop this other bishop. So these are just common themed moves where you're following general opening principles by just trying to develop your pieces as quick as possible. Now, why is it good to play this Italian game when you're starting out and learning in chess? Well, because e4 pawn openings by white usually open the center up more often and give your pieces room to attack and maneuver, and that unlocks a lot of tactics that can be played by you or against you by your opponent. And you definitely need to learn tactics. All through your chess career, you want to improve your tactics. But the better you get at tactics, the better you'll be able to attack your opponent and defend against your opponent. And many games are won or lost by tactics. All right, so let's see if there's anything else we could take a look at. So if the main move is played bishop to c5, we just looked at c3 being played here. So we could take a look at the second most common move, which is just a castle immediately. And now knight to f6, and then just d3, fortifying the center here. And then, black could play the same. And now, once again, we could have this c3 attack developing. And now it looks like most often a6 would be played to prevent a pin on the knight. And then rook to e1. So this is just an example of everybody developing, castling, getting the king to safety. h3 is played to prevent a pin and limit the scope of this bishop. And then we see once again this a5 move can be played to just, it's black's turn. So once again, a pawn push on the side to gain space here. And if this is ignored, which it looks like usually it is, the most common move is to develop the bishop here, and then more developing by black. And now here, it's kind of interesting. The most often played move is bishop to b5. So instead of retreating here, which then would allow possibly the a4 pawn, or a pawn to push to a4 and attack the bishop, and the bishop would have to decide whether to capture black's bishop or retreat to c2. It looks like bishop to b5 is most often played. And then, now what? Queen to b8. So that's interesting. We could take a look at that real quick. And now knight to f1, where the knight can reposition either up here to 3, or up here to e3 and try and reposition and move up towards the center or the king side. All right, and now it looks like queen to a7, the most played move, threatening an attack with this battery down here on the f2 pawn. So you get the idea of how an attack may occur. And here, bishop to e3 could be played, or the rook could protect. But if we look at this, then this is most often played, and then now the knight recaptures. So at this point, both sides are almost completely developed. Maybe this rook would move here, and the other rook could either stay here and bolster this pawn or move towards the center. And the same with white. The queen could move up maybe to c2 or any of these second rank squares, and then the rook could move in here towards the center. So you get the idea. Before the video goes too long, I guess I will conclude here. So one more time, e4, e5, great moves for beginners especially to start out and learn with, as the game usually trades off in the center. Although it was a little bit slower here. But after knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4 was the Italian game. And so in this opening, you're able to develop your pieces pretty quickly and get your king to safety, control the center, fight for the center against your opponent. So I'm sure you could play many great games with the Italian game chess opening. So if you all enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave comments or suggestions, especially if you want to see more of the Italian game in depth, or if you would like to see particular variations of this opening. And also let me know if there are any other openings that you would just like to know more about. And once again, this was just an introduction to give you a little taste of the Italian game. So I hope you enjoyed it, everyone. Have a wonderful day.